Welcome to the Wayland Public Library. Thank you for coming out tonight. Tonight we are excited to have local author Edith Scott Saavedra here to discuss her novel, The Lamps of Albarracín. Ms. Scott studied Spanish literature with Professor Juan Marichal at Harvard, along with political philosophy, history, and social theory. She earned her J.D. cum laude from Harvard Law as well, and has had a distinguished career as an international lawyer, business consultant, and author. Ms. Scott is the co-author of several leading works on the competitiveness of industries, regions, and nations, and The Lamps of Albarracín is her first novel. Just if you hadn't noticed, we're being filmed by Waycam tonight, so you'll see that on their channel, a broadcast of this presentation as well as it will be available via YouTube. So thank you so much to Ms. Scott for coming to share her book with us, and please join me in welcoming her to the library.
Thank you, Courtney. Waycam, it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. As Courtney mentioned, I'm the author of a historical spiritual novel, The Lamps of Albarracín, that was published in 2019 by Floricanto Press in California. And we did a simultaneous launch in English language and Spanish language editions because I thought it was really important to get the true story of multicultural Spain and resistance to the Inquisition out to the Spanish readers who haven't seen this story before. So I'd like to start with the video. My novel has a short video, and I played it last time I did this, but afterwards the audience members said we'd like to have seen it first. So I think what this is going to do is set the tone and take you back a little bit to that time and place. So, welcome, please. Perfect timing. Okay, Albarracín is a town in northeastern Spain. Today, Albarracín is one of Spain's foremost rural tourism destinations, attracting 50,000 visitors a year. It is beloved of the Spanish people. They hail it as the perfect medieval town. One website even said, better than Disney. 600 years ago, this region of Spain achieved the highest level of convivencia, or living together, of the three main Abrahamic faiths anywhere in Europe at the time. And today, this perfect medieval town, better than Disney, okay? There is no mosque. There is no synagogue. The synagogue is believed to lie under a church below ground. Now, this video is in the genre of emotional heritage, whose purpose is to inspire in the viewers love for the heritage that's shown. And as I take viewers along the paths that lead to the town, across the waterfall and the river, up the winding roads of this town on the hill, because they've all been there, they will remember their summer holidays in youth, their Christmas festivities, their spring visits to see the roses. And at the end, I have a surprise for them, that the Sephardim of Eragon are part of this beautiful heritage. And we also were part of an amazing achievement of interfaith brotherhood, sisterhood, and tolerance in medieval Europe. So here is the video for The Lamps of Albarracín. I think we should cut the lights a little bit. Is that good? You can see well? Okay. It's not showing.
Yeah, we have to pause.
Okay, we're going to pause.
We're going to hide PowerPoint.
Okay, so I need to hide something? Okay.
Let's escape for a second.
PowerPoint is here.
Mm-hmm.
Is it on now? Okay. No, it's not showing. So we're going to take it back, and we're going to start it again. Okay.
Stop. Yeah.
Now.
Okay. Sorry.
It's okay. This is the first time, but there's a first time for everything.
Stop.
That's okay.
Where did
PowerPoint is here. You had it for a minute.
How did I do that? Oh. Here we go.
So we're gonna take it onto large here. Okay, here we go. Fasten your seatbelts. And thanks to producer David Murolo, who was at the University of Bologna and produced this in Italy for the project. Okay, so now we're going to take this back down. How do I hit escape, right? And get out of here. And then we're going to go back. So I have to bring it back up again. Okay. Do slideshow from the beginning. Okay. Okay. Here we go. My story unfolds in a place called Aragon. Today, Aragon is a province in northeastern Spain. In the 1480s, it was a kingdom in Spain with overseas holdings. So the blue-gray on the map is water, and that's the Mediterranean Sea. See if I can use the pointer a little bit. Yeah. Got the Mediterranean Sea. And below we see the coast of North Africa, which is very important to my story. And we see what is today Tunisia, which at the time was Ifriqiya. And going clockwise, we got Portugal, Castile, going over into France. Holy Roman Empire was there at the time, down to Papal States. But if we look at what's sort of a toasted almond color, those were Aragon's overseas dominions. Through a loose dynastic alliance, Aragon controlled not only all the way to the coast of the Mediterranean in what's Iberia, and now I'm sure many of you have been to Barcelona. That's part of Catalonia, but at the time, Catalonia was part of Aragon, ruled by Aragon, and their reach extended past the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples. So if we come down here, I have a little caravel, and that was the type of sailing ship that was in use in the 1480s, early Renaissance. And if we take it back, we're back to Spanish Aragon. And ready to start. Is everybody clear on the map? Good. That's great. Okay. When I was a child and an adolescent, I spent time in Spain. My father was an art historian specialized in medieval art and architecture, so we didn't spend time at the beach. We visited museums all summer. National museums, regional museums, provincial museums, museums that were so obscure we had to find the guard with the key. Now, this was the 1970s, the Franco era, so these museums were conservative. And what I found time and time again were Roman Catholic themes portrayed over and over. the Madonna and Child, the Passion of St. John the Baptist, not to mention scenes from the life of Christ. I was raised in the Episcopal Church. At that time in my life, I didn't know about my Sephardic heritage yet. But even then, I was thinking, Spain, the land of the three religions, there must have been more than this. So in my novel, The Lamps of Albarracín, I set out to capture the multicultural Spain, still in existence in the 1480s, the early Renaissance. These were the years leading up to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And the social contract that had allowed the three faiths to live together in Spain was coming apart. My focus, the real story of the Inquisition, not the official one, how it was experienced by Jewish and Muslim children, narrated in the first person by a Jewish girl whose traveling companion is a Muslim girl the same age. And to my knowledge, this is the first-person narrative by a Sephardic girl with a Muslim friend in the Kingdom of Aragon. Hooray. But seriously, I decided it was paramount to give her the highest spiritual message possible in her historical context, and that is interfaith tolerance and brotherhood and sisterhood, a message that is urgently needed today. So spirituality and the arts are central to my novel, in particular the culture of Sephardic and Muslim Spain. Painting, ceramics, songs, fashion, recipes, I celebrate it. I bring it alive, and I bring the people alive. Now you can see this in my book's cover portrait. I designed it, I put it together, I put together the costume with the help of a seamstress, and I commissioned a classic portrait photographer from London. And this is based on paintings from Iberia from the 1480s, very closely, but with a difference, because the girl you see is Sarah. She is my protagonist, and she is one of the girls missing from those museum walls.
Quick question, please.
Yep.
Who is that?
That's my daughter, Kathy. Thank you. We have ancestry that has been traced back to the Lamps of Albarracín. So she is Aragonese, and she holds a very symbolic lamp, which is suitable for a novel titled The Lamps of Albarracín. So I brought it with me today. I should get that one out. And the green lamp that you see in the photo, it's the creation of a ceramist from Tel Aviv. It is etched with the design of the sacred olive. I found it after months of searching, and what I didn't know at the time is that the ancestors of the ceramist who created this in Albarracn were exiled from Spain in 1492. So for her and her parents and grandparents, this is a really important portrait because it symbolizes el retorno, or the return of at least Sephardic presence to Spain after so many centuries. And in my novel, the major characters have lamps, which give insight into the spirituality and a bit of the spiritual journey of the characters. And Sarah's friend Fatima also has her own very special lamp. This is a museum replica from the Museum of Córdoba of a beautiful lamp from the Emirate of Córdoba from around 1100 AD. So what I'd like to do, it's always nice to have artifacts. So we can pass them. We can pass this on this first, and it's always nice to touch. This is the one from Córdoba. So beautiful. Aragon was a powerhouse of Europe in the 1480s. At this time, before Christopher Columbus, the Mediterranean sea trade was big. It was at its height in terms of its importance in Europe. And for much of this, the locus of control was Aragon. They shared it with some of the city-states in what's now Italy. Aragon was very powerful. And the trade was largely carried out and managed by mudéjar and Jewish and Sephardic converso communities. The conversos were converts from Judaism to Christianity. And this made Aragon major players on the European stage The great Synagogue of Zaragoza, which no longer exists, there used to be a meatpacking district there, is believed to have had one of the largest congregations in Europe at the time, with an estimation of 2,000 to 3,000 people in its congregation. The Muslim population was very important to Aragon. Muslim and mudéjar families. The mudéjares were families of Muslim heritage who were converted to Christianity, but by and large continued to observe Islamic rites during this time. And they were leaders in property, real estate, construction, engineering, and architecture, design, finance, and trade. And the mudéjar merchant fleets based in Valencia, they controlled trading routes stretching all the way to Alexandria, Egypt, and beyond. In the late 1400s in Aragon, the Muslims and mudéjares accounted for a much higher percentage of the population than most elsewhere in Spain. And this isn't known now. You know, you think of Muslim Spain, you think of the south. But actually in the 1480s, Muslims and mudéjares accounted for nearly 40% of people in some cities in Aragon and 70% of the population in rural areas. And they were completely vital to agricultural production. So Aragon was very diverse in terms of people and religions. And the living together of people of different faiths, or convivencia, was among the most highly developed in all of Iberia. So let's look at the city of Deadwell, which was home to a multicultural society. This is Spanish Aragon, and we are going to be looking at Deadwell, which is next to Albarracín, and you've seen it in the movie. It's enlarged down below in the box, and it was a little bit far from the center of power, okay? The king came out of Zaragoza, and in those days, crossing these hills was a bit of work. So this area, traditionally, had had several hundred years of relative autonomy in doing its own thing. So what was it doing? Deadwell has a very multicultural heritage, and we see a blend of influences of the different cultures and faiths. In architecture, okay, it has an iconic tower. This is how Deadwell is known, and it is in the mudéjar style of Aragon. It dates to 1315, and it clearly shows the Moorish influence. It is absolutely gorgeous. And this style is distinctive, it is elegant, and it is unique to Aragon. Okay. Now, let's look at the detail. Look at that. Absolutely beautiful. And this is the tower of the Church of St. Martin. And what's really interesting was that it was designed and built by mudéjar architects and builders as a Christian church tower. So, multicultural. Okay, in terms of religious icons, here we see an image of the Madonna and Child in a cathedral in Deadwell. Now, my friend Rachel Spector from Newton, she lives in Newton, she was visiting Deadwell several years ago, and she took this picture because she saw something that inspired her to ask for a ladder in the cathedral and climb up and get this detail. Now, can you guess what Rachel noticed? I think she's pretty good. Okay, well, here's a hint. It's down here. Okay. The infant Jesus is wearing an amulet around his neck, and that is the hand of Miriam, also known as the hand of Fatima, also known as the hand of God. So here you have the infant Jesus wearing a religious icon meaningful to the three faiths of the city. When we look at ceramics, here is an artifact from Deadwell that inspired my story. It is the most amazing set of lamps for Hanukkah. It is called a Hanukkiyah from the 14th century. And until recently, this type of Hanukkiyah was largely unknown, even among experts. The original was discovered during excavations in the downtown. I think it was a parking lot. It uncovered the former Jewish quarter. It was underground. And it fascinated me that a set of lamps designed to illumine, to bring light and express faith, had survived in the dark for hundreds of years. So this Hanukkiyah inspired me to start writing my novel. And I also was inspired to commission from my book's artist team a replica, which is shown here, and some creative interpretations which are on display. And look carefully at the geometric designs on the tray. They are typical of Aragon. They go back to ancient times. And also the eyes on each lamp, which may have been talismans related to the ancient Egyptian eye of Horus. So Deadwell was this extraordinary city where Christians, Muslims, and Jews were in fact living side by side in houses along the same avenue. They were next-door neighbors, and they even engaged in real estate transactions with each other. Real estate deeds survive with handwriting in Hebrew, Arabic, and or Aragonese on the same document, depending on the buyer and the seller and the agent. So part of the reason why Deadwell was so diverse is, as I told you, it was relatively far from the center of power. So let's look up at the capital city of Aragon, Zaragoza, and let's see what was cooking there. In 1469, Castile and Aragon were separate kingdoms, though their dynastic lines were closely related, and a love match was engineered. Big love match. Think you know these guys. Between Ferdinand of Aragon, who at this time was 16 years old, and his cousin Isabel, who had inherited the crown of Castile through circumstances and also some devious means, and she was 17. So in a very romantic episode, young Ferdinand, dressed in disguise, galloped across Aragon to Castile. They fell in love, were married, and that was the beginning of the Catholic monarch team of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, in the court of Castile, there was a group that had a lot of influence, the Dominican Order of the Catholic Church, and they were looking at a way to advance. So they put pressure on young Isabel, and they were persistent. And they brought her around to agreeing to activate the Inquisition in a new way. Now, the Inquisition was nothing new. It had been around for centuries, but it was administered by the Vatican, and that was too far away for the Dominicans, to get much benefit from it. So basically, the Dominicans convinced Isabel to set up the Spanish Inquisition, as we know it, or the Holy Office, as they knew it, or the New Inquisition. Now, to understand the Spanish Inquisition, we need to look at the rise of the Dominican Order. Its founder was St. Dominic, who came on the scene around 1200. There he is. And when you look at paintings and you see friars, and you try to figure out which Catholic religious order they belong to, here's a hint. You can recognize the Dominicans because they are black on white. And to me as a kid, this is sort of like bird watching because you see black wings on white bodies. The black is the cloak, the white is the robe underneath, and here you can see a painting of St. Dominic by a master painter, Pedro Berruguete, who was painting at the time of my story. And from the 13th century onwards, Dominicans were a real force in the militant persecution and hunting down of heretics, folks whose beliefs and practices were not in accordance with the Pope's teaching in the Vatican. First, they went after the Albigensians, a religious sect in southern France. Here is a painting of St. Dominic, presiding over the burning at the stake of Albigensians. St. Dominic in black and white is seen seated under the canopy at the top, you'll find him, overseeing the burnings at the stake. What happened is that eventually the Dominicans' military campaigns, and they were forcibly recruiting monks and brothers from convents across Spain to join these armies. Their campaigns against the Albigensians, who after all were a civil society, were so effective that there were fewer and fewer Albigensians out there. So rather naturally, they began to look for new targets, and they targeted the Jewish and converted Sephardic communities across Spain first. The families of Muslim heritage would be targeted later. So after Isabel became Queen of Castile, the New Inquisition set its sights on the biggest money chests in Castile, and they targeted the wealthy Jews and conversos of the city of Seville in the south of Castile, and they went after them there. Now, it's important to understand the motivation. The Dominicans got a share of the assets seized from convicted heretics, alive or dead. And there was a lot of wealth in Seville and a lot of estates. So this was in effect a declaration of a state of war, but it was treason and heresy to say so. The wealthiest families in Seville tried to defend themselves. They came up with a plan to kill the inquisitor, but they were found out and they were killed instead. Next, Isabella sent the New Inquisition into Toledo, which you all know, another big money pot, and the conversos got closer to defending themselves in Toledo, They actually arranged for a knife attack against the inquisitor on the streets of Toledo, but they were found out, and Christian crowds defended him and mobbed the assailants. So, back to Aragon. In 1484, King Ferdinand made the decision to send inquisitors into his kingdom, Aragon. The lead inquisitor sent into Aragon to the capital city of Saragossa was named Pedro de Arbues, and he was the darling, the protege of Tomás de Torquemada, who you've probably all heard of. And Torquemada was another Dominican. He was over 60. He was 62 at the time when he got pulled into this, and his name became synonymous with the criminal persecution and execution en masse of innocent people. And by the way, it was Torquemada himself who commissioned and paid for this painting of St. Dominic. And St. Dominic here, at his request, is portrayed as an inquisitor killing the dragon of heresy at his feet. It's interesting that the Prado Museum on its website states that St. Dominic was not, in fact, an inquisitor. And I find that often online they just show the upper half of this painting, maybe for political correctness or convenience, but personally, I take issue with it. So, Torquemada's protege, Pedro de Arbues, arrives in Saragossa in the spring of 1484. He presides at burnings at the stake. And in this case, the conversos of Aragon get it right, but to a certain and very tragic extent. Now remember that in Seville and Toledo, attempts to kill the inquisitor were thwarted. In Saragossa, one evening after dark, the inquisitor goes into the Cathedral of Laseo, enters a chapel in the dark, kneels in prayer, and from behind men jump out of the shadows and plunge knives into him. Blood everywhere, blood on the chapel floor, murder in the cathedral. Some say he was stabbed in the jugular, others in the back of the neck, and some say he died in 3 hours, and some accounts say in 3 days. But in any case, Pedro de Arbues, the darling of Torquemada, was dead. And who was blamed? A group of leading conversos. Now, these conversos were very powerful people. Jaime de Montesa was the highest judicial authority in the kingdom, and the conversos included persons related to the royal chancellor and the royal treasurer, and were leading financiers, on the European stage. Okay, right now, Aragon accounts for something like 3% of the Spanish economy, so it's hard to imagine. But one of these accused escaped over the Pyrenees, and he ended up in Florence as personal financial advisor to no less than Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, the main part of this story has been dramatized in a film made a few years ago for PBS, several years ago now. It's called The Secret Files of the Inquisition, and the episode is The Tears of Spain. They dramatize the murder and the trial and the execution, and I recommend it. As for the inquisitor, Pedro de Arbues, he was later canonized a saint by the Vatican. Notice his halo. Looking further south into Aragon, now we remember Teruel, the city where leading Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side, and a different inquisitor was sent into Aragon, into Teruel. And there was a surprise waiting for him, because the leading families of Teruel, a very diverse city, knew he was coming. At the gates of Teruel, he arrived on horseback with a ghastly entourage of hangmen and executioners, so state the records, dragging ropes and nooses. What a visitor. And a member of the town council met him at the gate and made him wait, and refused him entry into the town on the grounds that he couldn't prove that he had royal authority. And so the inquisitor turned his horse around, kicked up a cloud of dust, this is all recorded, and took his ghastly retinue back up the road to a monastery where they stayed for months as they negotiated with a very intransigent town council. But here is the most memorable part of the story. In the meantime, the town council of this small city sent a letter to King Ferdinand, and they objected to the Inquisition's entry into the city, and they wrote Ferdinand that His Majesty was wrong on moral grounds. They wrote, "The king was wrong to send the inquisitor to Teruel because the judgment of souls is reserved for God at the end of time." This is, to my knowledge, the only instance in the history of the Inquisition in which a city wrote a letter to the king objecting to the Inquisition and denying His Majesty's moral authority, and no one ever tried it again. The Catholic monarchs reacted with a scorched earth response, and they pledged troops to lay siege to their own city. Now, the town council of Teruel had been defending all the residents of Teruel behind its city walls as one people, regardless of faith. This was the end. Jewish families fled, conversos fled or stayed to their peril, the town council was apprehended, and the Inquisition started up quickly and held interrogations and presided over horrific burnings in the market square. Now, notably in Inquisition records from this time and place, one person has come down through the ages to us as a stalwart defender of her faith, a woman. Her name was Brianda de Besante de Santangel, and she was born into a family of conversos and was baptized at birth. Now, Brianda devoted her life to educating women and girls of Jewish heritage in the Jewish faith, and she taught them in her home, where she set up a school for women and girls. And from the evidence that I see, I surmise that she taught them Hebrew. Now, Brianda was apprehended. She refused to capitulate to the inquisitor. She defended her faith and explained what was wrong with the Christian faith to the end. Jewish scholars believe that her execution was covered up by sending her down to Valencia to be put to death sort of out of the way. And I believe that Brianda deserves to be remembered. I bring her and her story alive in my novel. So, today, Aragon is not well known in Spain as a center for Judaic culture, but you see that's not because the Jews and conversos were not players in Aragon. It's because they were the most resistant. And for that reason, the Catholic monarchs tried to wipe Judaism from the face of Aragon, and then their successors had several hundred years in which to do that, or try to do that. For example, if you look at the curriculum of secondary schools and baccalaureate curricula in Aragon, in the state schools, as of today, the Jews of Spain are not included in the history of Aragon, except for a single sentence, quote, "In 1492, the Jews left," close quote. That's all the students are getting. Over the last several decades, there has been work to recover the Sephardic heritage of Aragon. And two of the leaders have become friends of mine. And here is Javier Lopez to the left. He is an archaeologist. He has devoted his career to recovering the multicultural heritage of Aragon. And to the right, Miguel Ángel Montes. He's a professor at the University of San Jorge in Zaragoza, and he is one of the foremost authorities on the history of Judaic Aragon. And they send their greetings to you all. I wrote them over online that you're coming here, and they send their best wishes to you all. Okay. Till recently, it was believed that no synagogues in Aragon had survived intact at all. But this is where Professor Montes steps in. He uncovered a document whereby an early ruler had deeded a property to the Jewish community in the town of Ijar in Teruel for purposes of constructing a synagogue in the 15th century. And Professor Montes located the place. The site was occupied by a church, and it's known as the Church of San Anton Abad. Antonio Abad says. Okay, for years, Professor Montes petitioned to bring a team into the church to search for the foundations of a synagogue. His requests were denied, and he was ridiculed in the press. Well, about 3 years ago, permission was granted, and he took experts into that quote-unquote church to look underneath the paint. The first results were made public in October 2018, and these, to my knowledge, are not being presented anyplace else in the U.S., so this is a treat. This is a before picture. This is the before picture of the apse and the altarpiece of the church. Look at the altarpiece. Remember our bird watching? Birders out there? You see the black on white? How many Dominicans? 2. Okay. On the altarpiece. But what are they guarding? The next photo in sequence comes after the team removed this altarpiece, took the paint off. Now this is looking at exactly the same place. In the interim, some restoration was done on the ceiling, so it looks a little different, but this is the same view. And what do we see? Well, the blue was added by the Dominicans. There was something here to do with the Virgin Mary, and so the blue is not original. Well, what else is there? Let's look more closely at what came up. This is the frame of the entry to the Ejal, or as the Spanish pronounce it, the Aron HaKodesh. Yeah, I always get teary-eyed, where the Torah scrolls are kept. It dates to 1410, and what we see here is the most exquisite gesso work in high Gothic style. And this discovery alone puts Ijar now on the world map of Judaic heritage. And you might ask, well, what's multicultural about this? Well, some research was done who created this incredible arch and gesso work. And the architect and designer who designed this gesso work for the synagogue, his name was Muhammad. That's what we know. And Muhammad also was engaged by the Pope in Rome to design churches for the Vatican. And he found inspiration from High Gothic in Eastern Europe. So he was very urbane, very sophisticated. Now, what else is coming from beneath the paint? Let's look at the wall. These letters are believed to be part of the Aleph Bet, a series of letters that they could interpret easily with this handwriting at the time. And the handwriting matches that in a book that was published in Saragossa in the 1490s before the expulsion. Okay, so above, what is that? Well, I'll give you a hint. There's 7 of them. And on the wall, right, 7 of these. Okay, you guessed it. Professor Motis believes this is a mural that's emerging, a mural of a menorah. And it hadn't seen the light of day in 500 years. And there's no mural like it anywhere. This is big, okay? And Professor Motis has sent you this photo from his archives to show you what he thinks might have inspired the artist as well. He's found this in a folio. Now, this is gold-plated, but this is contemporaneous, and you can see the similar style. Okay, I'm pleased to report that thanks to the advocacy of Tarbut Sepharad in Spain, the local government, and the Foundation for Jewish Heritage in London, the government has announced there will be funding to go ahead with the restoration of the synagogue. And it was just announced on the 2nd of December of this year that for the first time in the history of Aragon, the Jews of Spain will be included in the teaching of Spanish history at the secondary school level in Aragon state schools. And this is thanks to the efforts of many groups, including the Tarbut Sepharad Calatayud, including our friend Javier Bona Lopez, who you've seen here, his colleagues, and the Ciudadanos Party, and others who have fought for this. Fortunately, the history of Muslim and mudéjar Aragon is already included as an important theme in the history curriculum. Okay, so that is there. So we can start to imagine what the synagogue looked like, but what about the mosques? In my novel, Sarah's traveling companion is a young Muslim woman, also a teenager, named Fatima. And Fatima does show up in the records. It was a very common name in Aragon in the birth and marriage records at the time, Fatima. And why was Fatima leaving Spain? Well, even by the 1480s, the Muslims of Aragon, they were under pressure. They were feeling growing pressure from the church and the crown to not only to convert to Christianity, but to abandon all vestiges of Muslim rites and attend church. So in essence, Fatima and her aunt Aziza in my story, Aziza is another authentic name from the time, they're getting out of Spain early. And they are heading for Tunis in Tunisia. And in my novel, they are the ones who help Sarah escape from the Inquisition and escape from Spain. Now, after my story ends, historically, in the 1500s, the Spanish Inquisition turned its sights on people of Muslim heritage. Catholic orthodoxy was imposed via royal decree. There were forced conversions. And the first expulsion, the so-called expulsion of the Moriscos, began in 1609. Persons of Muslim descent, converts who were called Moriscos, were expelled from Spain. Many thousands were placed on ships against their will, though some left voluntarily. And this is shown here at a port in Valencia. And they were sent, many of them, to North Africa. Now, I looked into the specifics of this, and in 1610, large numbers of Aragonese of Muslim heritage left Aragon for Tunis in particular. Tunis was a very important destination. And interestingly, they took with them some techniques. Because remember, the Muslims and mudéjares were leaders in building and design and architecture and engineering. And they took with them to Tunis some building techniques for making baked clay roof tiles that are actually typically Aragonese and also can be seen in Tunis today. Now, people outside Spain, they don't generally associate Aragon with Muslim culture. And this is also because, as was the case of Sephardim, so much was wiped out. Now, there are gems of Islamic architecture in Aragon, and the best preserved today, which is relatively little known, it is called the Aljaferia Palace in Saragossa. It was constructed by the Muslim rulers of the Taifa of Saragossa in the Middle Ages before the Christians conquered the city. And the Christians valued this palace so much, because they weren't capable of anything close, that it was converted into a Christian palace. So this is northeastern Spain. This is Aragon. It's absolutely exquisite. And today we are very fortunate that one of Aragon's most celebrated photographers, José Ángel Guimera, he visited the Aljaferia earlier this year. And José Ángel also sends his greetings. I was in touch with him today. And he has sent us a photograph of the ceiling designs. An extraordinary photograph. I think he took a beautiful photograph, and look at the exquisite mudéjar and actually Muslim work on this, because that was created, I believe, before the Christians. It could have been done afterwards. So this palace is very grand, and the mosque in it was very grand. But remember that the Muslims made up, and mudéjares accounted for up to 70% of the rural population, and so the mosques in medieval Aragon, they tended to be small neighborhood mosques. They were very popular, and they were plentiful in the 1400s in the countryside. But now, after the expulsion of Moriscos, because most were demolished, today it takes an expert eye to find remnants of them. So here's a typical example of what, if anything, remains of mosques in the old towns of Aragon. You ready? An empty lot? Actually, yes. But this empty lot used to be a mosque. And how can we tell? Well, the sanctuary that housed the Holy Quran is called the Mural, and its arch is very distinctive in design. It has a horseshoe arch at the top. We have it here. Let's see a close-up. So here we see the upper portion, and this mihrab has been filled up halfway, as was the custom. Now, I'm delighted to share with you today a true story, and it is courtesy of Javier Bona, who I've shown and introduced to you. There is a small village in Aragon, Tortoles. It had a medieval granary. From the outside, as long as anyone could remember, there was just nothing special about this old building. Okay. And for as long as anyone could remember, it had been used for the storage of hay, fodder. But in 1980, a man entering the granary looked up, and he noticed some unusual wooden colors, beams. They were painted in beautiful red and black and yellow. And he phoned Javier. He said, Javier, there's some funky things in this granary. You better get on over here. So Javier came in, and he recognized the paintings. He recognized this as being of mudéjar Muslim heritage. And he immediately ordered the bales of hay to be removed. And after the bales of hay and fodder were cleared out, you see it? An amazing moment. Javier saw something that caught his eye, and lo and behold, a walled-up archway, and we can see the Horseshoe Arch. It is, the mihrab, where the Quran was kept. And what has emerged over time is a precious small mezquita, or small mosque, from around the year 1450. Now, the Mosque of Tortoles has been restored in secular capacity. You can see how it looks now, okay, looking there. And you can see looking east. As was the case with the synagogue, the mosque was converted into a Christian church, and an altar was erected there. And a few decades later, when a new church was built, this beautiful sanctuary was abandoned. And this is facing west. You can see it is a museum now. This is indeed also a uniquely multicultural mosque. because it is the only mosque in Aragon known to have been constructed under the Christian rulers. Now, what I find most extraordinary, I mean, there are a lot of wonders here, is the coffered ceiling. Now, you've seen a very sophisticated ceiling from the palace, but look at this provincial work of art. Wow. Now, this includes inscriptions in Arabic, including the words for Muhammad, Allah, and to hand over the heart. Look at that. Now, the congregation at the time could recognize and read all of this, but today's scholars, at least the scholars in Spain, cannot read them all. They don't know what they all say. Not yet, but there are other intriguing and unexpected details in this mosque that speak to the flowering of a highly sophisticated, developed culture, that speak to the heart, paintings of birds and fragments of love poetry in Arabic. The scholars aren't quite sure why there were fragments of love poetry in the mosque. They're looking into it. Historical records tell us that when Islam was banned in Aragon, a lone caller to prayer, the muezzin, he refused to capitulate. He fled from the city of Deadwell into the hills, and he took refuge in a cave. He became an outlaw, and for decades thereafter, his voice was heard at sunset, echoing across the empty hills, calling the faithful to prayer. And recently, a small group of Muslim international tourists, they visited this restored mosque, the museum, and many of them broke down in tears. So in my novel, I recreate houses of worship, and I bring them alive in my story. The Synagogue of Ijar, which we saw tonight, and also ones that no longer stand, the Synagogue of Albarracín, the great Synagogue of Zaragoza, and the minaret of Albarracín, which once dominated the skyline and must have been glorious. We don't know what it looked like, but drawing on architectural history, between the Deadwell style and, for example, Casablanca, I could at least put together a reasonable visual image of what it must have looked like. So, I am passionate about this. I am passionate about the restoration and celebration of cultures that repressive regimes have tried to destroy. In particular, the cultural treasures of multicultural, diverse societies. Why? Well, the Smithsonian Magazine recently interviewed the curator of the Imperial War Museum in the United Kingdom, who said, quote, "The destruction of culture, it's sort of an accepted sideline to war. One of the main reasons for destroying culture is to send a message. We have victory over you. We have power over you. And it's because culture means so much." William Butler Yeats, the poet, is credited with saying, "In imagination begins responsibility." And the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami, who struggled to make sense of the horrors of the 20th century, he framed it as a challenge more for society. Our responsibility begins with our imagination. I believe that imagination, properly directed, helps shape the future, and we have the responsibility to use it. If we harness our imagination to re-envision diverse houses of worship, we are more likely to protect and respect diversity today. If we understand the thinking that led to atrocities, we can recognize warning signs and work to prevent them. And the very exercise of multicultural recreation, our informed reimagining, it helps bring us together, and it strengthens our commitment to a multicultural and tolerant future. I'm so glad that you've joined me tonight in this reimagining and recreation. So that's the main part of my presentation. I've shown you the novel's video, and I also have some books and artifacts here for sale at the table. And again, thank you very much for coming tonight. So that's it. We have fruit salad and cider and some gluten-free cookies, so please have a snack. Thank you so much for coming. And I am here to take questions.
I just had a question. You said you had your heritage, Sephardic heritage. How
Yeah.
did you find out about that?
Okay. There were were definitely aspects of the way my mother brought me up in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s. She was from Central America, from a very rural and isolated clan that I didn't understand. And it wasn't until I read really a definitive book by Professor David Gitlitz, who was formerly professor of history in Providence, University of Rhode Island, that I recognized many of her sayings and cultures and beliefs and teachings as Talmudic, traditional Spanish Jewry. I did convince one of my male cousins on the male line to have a genetic test, and that dovetailed, to make it short, with a surname, which is actually a teeny aldea or teeny village within the larger Aljama of Albarracín. And it is such an unusual name, there isn't any other. So that's how that happened. But that's not why I wrote the book. You know, that was nice to find. But when I saw the PBS film, and I was so moved by the secret files of the Inquisition, and I realized the incredibly important drama that, unveiled there, that was unveiled, that took place in Saragossa, that's when I decided that, this really deserved to be told. And what's really interesting is the whole story that I've told you about the people, the town council of Deadwell, defending its people of different faiths as one people behind one city wall. I owe that to a professor named Mary Halave, and she wrote her doctorate dissertation on the Morisco culture, society, and identity in this part of Spain. And she's the one who brought all of this to the modern eye. And later, separately, Jewish scholars managed to wrest some records from the Inquisition from a vault under the Vatican. And those two accounts, completely separate, dovetailed, and they showed me a totality which had been suppressed in Spain. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to write the novel.
I want to ask you, it's fascinating how certain places in certain times are so multicultural and welcoming to different cultures. And I'm wondering, and it's not, of course, always the case, more often than not, it's the opposite.
Correct.
So what do you think were the secret ingredients that made for this tolerance of different cultures at that point in time?
Right. First, I think if we look at the seeding of the population in this part of Spain in the Middle Ages, there was a pretty good mix of people of different faiths in this particular area. And beyond that, I tend to believe that in terms of a kind of a division of labor in economic terms, that it worked together as a cohesive whole. Because, the Muslims offered their skills, abilities, capabilities, and the Jews and the conversos had their own set, somewhat overlapping, and the Christians were actually less involved in commerce and that kind of thing because of the old hidalgo mentality that, a gentleman doesn't get his hands dirty. It's a little bit of an overstatement. But a lot of that nastiness that took place in Teruel was precisely because the old Christian families, and they were known as old Christians, they were feeling threatened with the economic rise of the conversos and the mudéjares. They were starting to feel threatened. They were starting to feel politically threatened. And so a young man from one of these families married one of the daughters of the wealthiest converso families in that city. And it's in my book. It's an amazing story. I don't think the marriage was as happy as was portrayed because, in fact, he sent, as soon as he seized control, he volunteered to the king to lay siege to the city, to put it back in old Christian hands. And he sent his father-in-law and two brothers-in-law to the stake, either in person or in effigy, as soon as he got the fires going. So what you have here is a polity that was working together, and then you had a shift. You had a shift because, in terms of hegemony, the clique that thought that it had sort of an indefinite right to be in control was finding that it just wasn't as competitive as it had been before, and there was a lot of reaction. It's a very reactionary period.
So the conversos were Jews that had converted to Christianity?
Yes. This had been going on for a couple hundred years.
In your
I would say that most of them did.
And so they were not, the fact that they converted didn't make them safe from the Inquisition.
You see, in Aragon, there hadn't been an Inquisition. I mean, Isabel was sending it into Castile. And it was a big surprise for them when Ferdinand, sent it into Aragon. You saw what happened there. Yeah. In the 1480s, this was a turning point. Up until that time, the conversos and the mudéjares were basically able to convert to Christianity if they so chose or were forced in name only and continue observing their own heritage and rites. So that Jaime de Montesa, who was the highest judicial authority in the Kingdom of Aragon, and Ferdinand left Jaime de Montesa in control of the legal system when he went off to woo Isabel. So you see, they thought they had a lot of power. It was stripped from them in this episode. But he, in the Inquisition records, he was later executed. He, in the Inquisition records, did testify that, during this power, during the period coming up to the entry of the Inquisition, on the Shabbat, they spread a white linen cloth, and he read the Torah, and during the week, he was the most powerful judicial authority in the realm. And that was accepted, and to him and to them at that time, to many of them. And granted, they wanted to get ahead, and there were higher positions available to people who, quote-unquote, converted. But for people of the time, that was normal. And for the mudéjares, in particular, they really kept to Islamic rites. They really did. And there were so many of them, and there were many mosques, and that's one reason why the mosque we saw was the only one that was allowed to be built under Christian rule. Because here you have another hegemony challenge for the Catholic monarchs. Right? They're in the process of defeating the last taifa, the last emirate in Granada and surroundings. So they have in mind, they're envisioning the rise of the modern nation state, and they see it as a Christian state. And the Muslim and mudéjar population was large and growing very fast. You had 40% in the cities, you had 70% in the countryside. And they were literally, their records show they were afraid that they would end up being outnumbered. And that's one of the reasons why they very cruelly started to refuse to allow the building of new mosques. And the one in Totalus was the last one, and it's small.
Also, they were worried about the Ottoman Empire, which is growing in the east.
Totally. And in fact, if you look a little bit later in the 1500s, the mudéjares were very unhappy with the Inquisition, even though at the time it was focused on Jews and conversos, pardon me. I mean, by a technicality, the Catholic Church only asserted control over baptized Christians. But the problem is that many of these people were baptized, at birth, and, it just seemed to be a mere detail, like a baptismal certificate, and then it ended up, threatening their lives or changing their lives. And so there's a story that in the mountains in this region, the mudéjar population was secretly producing munitions, cannonball, etc., for the fleet. And they had special convoys that were going at night to get these onto the Muslim traders' ships and get them out to support. So this was a very fractious time, and these people knew what was going on in the region. There's no question they were totally connected. Yeah.
So thank you so much for bringing us these amazing stories, and I really appreciate your mission, and really I'm so I guess enamored of the idea that you are working with the children in Spain, and teaching them there. Amazing. But my question is different. I definitely want to get your book, but how did you do your research on this? What kind of journey was that? In a sense, and it might take the time we have, but you seem to know so many details, and I'm wondering how do you collect all that?
Well, I've been interested in this for about 10 years, and actively researching and writing is sort of blended into 7 years. And then because it also was a bilingual effort. So I had leading Latin American authors and writers help, doing the writing in Spanish. I did a lot of reading and I did a lot of research, but I did it with such a passion and such an interest that it never seemed heavy or a burden to me. It was just like drinking water. I just love all of this. So I guess for me it comes very naturally to put together these different aspects, to see the parallels. Nobody told me that, this was Totalus and look at this and look how you see that. No, I mean, I was just getting information that, my colleagues in Spain were sending. And I began to see, oh, look at that, and then look at this. And I can see parallels. And how does this fit into the process of political and economic change? And that's how I came at it. I did study the culture and beliefs of the conversos and the records of the Inquisition in particular depth. And again, I'm very grateful to Professor David Gitlitz, whom I reached out to and got to know, and he actually reviewed one of my manuscripts, which was really, really kind. Yeah. Yes, Jerry.
At the same time, you were busy with your occupation as a lawyer, as a business
Yeah.
consultant, and all that.
That's right. I was living in Singapore when I wrote this, actually. Yeah. And no, but Singapore is an amazing small city where, you see, I was there for 13 years. Frankly, I don't know if I'd lived in a suburb of Boston, as beautiful as it is, for 13 years, that I would have been able to imagine all the interaction between people of different faiths. Because in Singapore, you've got that every day. You have a large population of people of Malaysian origin who are Muslim, and you have Christians of all different stripe, and lots of Buddhists. You have people from the Indian subcontinent with a host of different religious observances, and that's just the start of it. So, it was the constant interaction that I think sparked me to be able to recreate this. Yeah.
It's fascinating to me that you wrote this in 2 languages. Did you first write it in English, or did
Oh,
you
yeah.
simultaneously? Or?
I researched in both languages. I definitely wrote it in English, but it's a curious thing because some of the language definitely came to me in Spanish. But I am not trained to write literary Spanish. So what I did was I was really, really fortunate that 2 really, really gifted Cuban authors who are recognized in their own right, they agreed to serve as literary translators. And one of them is Nestor Díaz de Villegas. He was a political prisoner under Castro. He was put in jail, I think, at the age of 19 for writing a poem about the avenue of Carlos III when it was still Carlos III and not some Marxist leader's, avenue. And he refused to repent. He was actually one of the prisoners involved in the prisoner exchange, prisoner exchange. And what's curious is that when he came to the United States, he chose to officially return to the religion of his ancestors and converted to Judaism. And he was just the perfect person to be telling this story in Spanish, because to the extent that there are Kabbalistic aspects, he was telling me what they were, and to an extent that I didn't understand, because he actually takes lessons to interpret the Zohar. And so he was explaining to me what was coming out of my subconscious, which is one of those inexplicable things, but it's beautiful. It was a great experience. So I do not take credit for the literary Spanish because I couldn't have done it, but I was a fiend when it came to reviewing the manuscripts and making sure that it said what I intended and making sure that they were parallel. And it did take a lot of time. Anybody else? So this is my own passion project, and I do it to get the message out. If any of you know of any groups, interfaith groups, any groups, any mosque, any synagogue, any church, any secular group that might like a free presentation, I'm like Johnny Appleseed with the apples, only I come with multicultural Spain, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
As we are from Tunis,
Yes.
my wife, her blood goes back to Spain.
Really? Oh, this is really incredible.
That's why she's white and blonde, because North African were like me, but her origin, because when the Muslim left, as we are Muslim,
Yes.
when the Muslim left Spain after the Inquisition, Yes, they settled in Tunis, most of them.
That's what the records told me.
Yes, there are a few synagogues now in Tunis, like spread all over. And they settled in Tunis, and the Muslim, they settled in the northwest because they were good in agriculture.
You see?
Yeah. And they settled in the northwest, and she's from the northwest part of the country.
Wonderful.
And most of the people are white, blonde, you know.
Good example. And I'm Sephardic also.
Cool.
So, Toledo,
Yeah.
so dark. Dark and dark skin and dark everything.
Olive skin, doesn't it?
Yeah,
That's
olive.
cool.
And my ancestors went to the Ottoman Empire and ended up in, first it was Greece
Yes.
and Smyrna, and then Salonika, and then it became Turkey. So
Oh,
I
this
grew
is
up with
totally
this
cool.
very confusing family history. I never, as a child, could understand where anybody came from. You know, because my grandmother would talk to somebody would say, "Where are you from?" And she would say, sometimes Turkey. And sometimes she would say Greece. And it was very confusing, but I got into the same thing that you're doing, which is writing a lot of books
Oh, cool.
with Sephardic interest, and that's because I was trying to figure out and unravel all these complicated connections, and it's fascinating, but it's also I found it very sad to go back to Spain and to see how the Jews have just been erased. We were with a tour guide with a small group of people,
Mm-hmm.
and we passed something that had some Ladino written,
Mm.
and somebody asked, "Oh, what is that?" And she said, the tour guide said, "Oh, it's nothing." And she just
Well,
walked away.
The Hanukkah that I brought back, I just saw it when I was scanning photographs, and Professor Gitlitz in his book said that they really didn't exist in Spain, just some stone ones in Navarre. When I saw this from a tourist photo, my eyes popped. I said, and it said Lámparas de Hanukkah. And you know that when I went into the e-archives of that museum, it's not under religious objects. It's under miscellaneous Middle Ages.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the reasons why I have had the replica donated to a synagogue here to be lit, and I'm letting them know in the museum that it's being lit. It's to get the message across that this was a sacred object. Thank you. You know.
Yeah, they really have done a very good job of erasing it. But then there are a lot of people who are in Spain who are finding their heritage,
Yeah.
and there are groups who may not convert back, but they are researching
This is
together.
absolutely right. You know, I made up I know that I think Courtney's there. We're going to lose the room, so I need to stop pretty soon, right? Are we going to lose the room, or are we okay? A little time, 5 minutes? So, okay, because I'd like you to have an opportunity to buy the book. Quick things. Yes, one of the protagonists in my book leaves for Salonika, so I think you'll enjoy that. And at the end, my Muslim characters are very proud of the contribution that ancient Tunis of Ifriqiya as Carthage contributed to the culture of Aragon. And they explain that in the past, Aragon was at one point actually under the dominion of Carthage, and remains have been found. And I remember we were discussing this, and I said, absolutely, it's totally cool. There is a little town called Canta Vieja. It's a very beautiful town. It doesn't sound like anything, but it comes from Carthagus Pectus. It comes from old Carthage, when that was a military headquarters for the Carthaginians. So it's a very interesting sort of multicultural history. Yes, Jerry?
My story will not last 5 minutes. It's very brief. My father was born in Galway, Ireland. And there's a section of Ireland that has what they call the Black Irish. Believe it. Have you heard that story before? A Spanish shipwrecked. A lot of the Spanish sailors swam to the west coast of Ireland and intermingled with the Irish colonies. And therefore they have a black Irish, dark-skinned Irish, as opposed to red hair and freckles.
It's true.
There's a book in that. Yeah.
I think there have been some pretty romantic ones, too. Okay. So, Great. Okay. So I'm going to be here for book signing. The books, it's cash only if you'd like a book. It's also available on Amazon. I have some copies in English. I have just 2 copies in Spanish. I'm not sure whether anybody wants a Spanish version, but if you want one, don't pick up the Spanish by mistake. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so happy you came. Thank you for coming.